Good afternoon. I'm Allison Bainbridge, and I want to extend a welcome to our audience watching online by Zoom, as well as those of you who are here with us live. Thank you so much for joining us at Book Passage today. In celebration of Elizabeth Weingarten's new book, How to Fall in Love with Questions. We are joined in conversation by May Somali. We're so pleased to have both of them here today. Journalist and applied behavioral scientist Elizabeth Weingarten charts a new path to embrace the questions of our lives. Instead of seeking fast, easy answers inspired by cutting-edge research and age-old wisdom from the poet Rainer Maria Rilke. I have questioned people, quote unquote, experts who often advise, preach, or suggest that they have the answer to happiness or success. We have many books that claim that. I'm not saying don't buy the books. I'm just saying that there just so isn't always one size fits all. Hence, we do have so many books by so many different authors that have great ideas and great suggestions. When I was reviewing Elizabeth's book, though, I thought, wow, how perfect. She is suggesting that it is questions rather than answers that can, as she says, be our teachers. I love this concept and cannot wait to hear the discussion today about how to fall in love with questions and how it challenges us to unlock our mind and embark on the kind of self-discovery that's only possible when we feel most alive. That is, when we don't know what will happen next. Elizabeth has worked at the intersection of science and storytelling. She's worked on the editorial staffs and written for many publications. She's a very local author living in Marin with her husband and adorable infant son back in the back there. May Somali is founder and CEO at Human Leadership Lab, a global leadership development company. She's a speaker, facilitator, coach, researcher, investor, and board director. She wears many hats to unlock leadership potential in organizations and teams. As a leading voice on leadership, entrepreneurship, and the future of work, May's insights have been featured in multiple reputable publications. Most importantly, though, she is a good friend of Elizabeth. We're so honored to have May join us all the way from Australia. So please give a very warm welcome to Elizabeth and May.
Thank you so much, Alison, and welcome to Elizabeth's book launch. It's so awesome to see some familiar faces of loved ones, friends, and the community in the audience. And Elizabeth, I've been anticipating this day for many years. I can only imagine how you're feeling.
Yes, the same way. Many years. Almost since the time that we first met.
We did. And I think we met about 8 years ago. And if I remember correctly, it was an accidental meet. Mm-hmm. But the one thing I remember vividly from our first coffee date was that you told me you loved questions. And you started to pepper me with all kinds of great questions about how I was making investment decisions at the time and the questions in my life. And little did I know that thread, that love for questions would essentially lead to this amazing day and the launch of your extraordinary book. And I'm really pleased to be here with you today to hear a little bit more about the backstory and get to know your relationship with questions and this wonderful book.
Well, I'm so elated that you are here, and to come all the way from Australia is so special, and you've been such a special part of my life for this whole journey. So I can't imagine anyone else that I would prefer to be in that seat.
The honor is all mine, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And Elizabeth, I'm excited to dig in. So I'd love to keep this conversational. We will have a chance for audience questions at the end. One of the things that's really fascinating about your book is that it really starts with this story about love. And we got the word love in the title as well. A story about love and marriage to Anthony, who's there at the back with your lovely son, Jake. But you quickly tell us that it's not a book about marriage. It's a book about uncertainty. Tell us a little bit more about what got you curious about this topic. Why write a whole book about uncertainty? What's the backstory here?
Yeah. So this story also starts with love, but not actually the story that I initially tell in the book. It starts with my experience dating in Washington, D.C. And I'm curious if any of you have ever had this experience, but what happened to me while I was dating in DC was I was going out on a lot of dates with men who unfortunately would not ask me a single question during the whole time that we were out. And this happened again and again. And at first I thought maybe this is me. But then I talked to other people and it sounded like, no, this was a universal experience, and not just with men, but with friendships that people had, having relationships where the other person just never asks you a single question, never shows any curiosity about who you are and what you want. And so as a journalist, this at first was upsetting to me because I was like, am I ever going to find somebody that asks me a question? But then I got really curious about it. And I started doing a lot of writing and research and reporting, and really started to dig into the intersection of question asking and identity. Yes, please, everybody come in and fill in into the front. Don't be shy. Um, um, and what happened was I became really curious about questions. And as a journalist and applied behavioral scientist, I had been interested in questions for a long time because questions are really currency in those professions. But as I dug in further to this topic of questions, something happened to all of us, actually, the pandemic. And I had revered questions from this standpoint of journalism and behavioral science. I was researching them. I became to see questions as this kind of interpersonal superpower. And the people who could ask great questions were the people who not only were successful in their professional lives, but also were developing much closer and deeper relationships with the people around them. And yet we continue to live in a culture that I think values answers far more than we value questions. And so had this in my mind. Then the pandemic hit, and a couple of things happened in the pandemic. One was I got married, which was very exciting, but it was also a very challenging time because in the early months of my new marriage, it was very challenging for a lot of reasons that I get into in the book. But I was starting to question, did I marry the right person? Was this the right relationship for me? At the same time that this was happening, I had embarked on a kind of new creative pursuit, and I left my job to pursue it. And I ultimately found myself at this place where the creative pursuit that I was trying to make happen was failing. And so I didn't have a job. I was questioning my marriage. I wasn't sure if I was ever going to make it as a creative in this way that I wanted to. And I found myself kind of buckling under these questions in my life of like, what am I doing with my life? Am I in the right relationship? And that was around the time that I fortuitously found out about Rainer Maria Rilke, who is a poet who was writing in the early 1900s, and found Letters to a Young Poet. And for folks who aren't familiar with this book, Letters to a Young Poet is a book of correspondence between this poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, and Franz Capus, who is at the time he's writing, he's a 19-year-old kid, basically. He's writing to Rilke as this, wise poet, all of 27 years old. And like many 19-year-olds, Capus is asking Rilke all types of questions, not just about how do I become a poet, but how do I live my life? And Rilke very famously responds to Capus not with answers, but by telling him to, quote, try to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign tongue. And I read this passage and I was so struck by it because on the one hand, this was such a beautiful idea, right? If only we could all just love these questions of our lives. But on the other hand, I, as somebody who researched questions, who revered them professionally, I had never felt further away from this. I hated the questions in my life at that moment. I hated this constant questioning of like, am I in the right relationship? What am I doing with my life? These questions felt like my tormentors, right? And all I wanted was to get answers for them. And so I was really mired in this uncertainty. And it was at that point in life that I became really curious about, is it even possible to love the questions of our lives? How do we do this? And who are the people that maybe are doing this better than I am right now? And that was really what set me off on the journey to write the book. And especially, I think for me, the urgency has been, how do we do this in a world and a context in which so many of us have become addicted to fast, easy answers?
I love that you bring your own story into it. And I think one of the real interesting things is for many of us in this room, you play that role in our life as someone who asks really good questions of us. I can see some nods in the audience. Elizabeth is the question asker, and you do this as a profession. As a journalist, as an applied behavioral scientist, you touched on the reverence you have for questions professionally. How does this reverence and this fascination with questions, how did that influence the way you think about questions? Because you reference that, and yes, yet this disconnect with being able to do that in your own personal life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think this was one of the most kind of striking moments for me was the fact that as a journalist, and there are many journalists in the audience and applied behavioral scientists, as I said, questions are really currency. Questions are portals into new stories, into new ways of relating to the people that you're interviewing. It can completely change the nature of something that you're writing if you ask a different question, opens up a completely different avenue of conversation. In behavioral science, questions are the ways that research is designed. So the question that you ask determines what you discover as a behavioral scientist. And so I was so aware of the role that questions play in those professions. But as I talked to people and as I, dug into this myself, I did see this disconnect in terms of our ability to exist in uncertainty in our professional lives versus our ability to do that in our personal lives is very different. And often people are not thinking about the two as interrelated.
So has it stretched your conception of what you think about as a question, as both a storyteller and a scientist?
Yes. And I think to me, questions have become so much more than, kind of these external ideas. But I have, for me, questions in that way, I mean, something that struck me actually in my research and conversations was I interviewed a theoretical physicist by the name of David Kaiser, and he told me that what he's more concerned with the questions in his life than the answers, and he described the continuity of questions stretching across time and questions creating communities, and so I have really stopped thinking about questions as isolated ideas, right? But as questions that can connect us and that can create communities kind of across time and space. When you think about some of the key questions that are enduring for humans, right? Like, who am I? What am I doing with my life? How do I live a life of purpose and meaning? These are questions, or even how to live in uncertainty. These are questions that people have been asking for millennia, and they really do connect us to other people if we let them.
You reference uncertainty, and I think that for many of us here in the audience and online, we're living in some of the most uncertain times. And yet, I think that's a line that we can probably say for many years. Like, each era that we're living in is the most uncertain, whether it's technologically, politically, economically. You referenced the pandemic and the uncertainty that brought. Your book references that uncertainty that we're living in as something that is the state of the world, but you also talk about it as a lived experience. Talk to us a little bit more about your definition of uncertainty, because I think one of the things that's really unique about your book, and Alison referenced this, is we're told that we should just embrace this uncertainty, kind of those platitudes you refer to, embrace it, just go for it. It's something you got to do. And yet you tell us that that's not enough, that we've actually got to learn to love the questions. So what is the difference? Kind of tell us firstly about how do you define this uncertainty that we're told to embrace, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about how we do the opposite.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't know about all of you, but when I was in this period of uncertainty in my life, I picked up a lot of self-help books and listened to a lot of podcasts. And something that I heard again and again was, you've just got to embrace uncertainty. And this felt to me like such a hollow, empty way to talk about, or way to address somebody who's going through something really hard in their life. I think, you tell somebody who, for instance, is really struggling in their relationship or waiting on the results of a biopsy, or, these moments in which you don't want to embrace uncertainty, in which it feels really hard to just tell somebody, oh, you just got to embrace it. Just felt so tone deaf and hollow. And so I'll touch on this kind of difference between embracing uncertainty and loving the questions, which to me was this fundamental mindset shift. And to understand why, you kind of have to go back to this Rilke quote that I talked about at the beginning, this encouragement to love the questions of our lives, but also to know a little bit about what love meant to Rilke. And Rilke describes love as the most difficult task we have as humans. And he also says that it's up to us to lean into what's difficult. And so, he talks about love as really one of the most challenging and rewarding and, wonderful, taxing, all of the things, part of life. And for me, it was really helpful to start thinking of uncertainty and my relationship to uncertainty in the same way as I would any type of committed relationship, right? We know that even when we love somebody, there are days when we don't want to talk to them, when we're upset, when we would rather just kind of throw up our hands. But what it's really about is the commitment, and the kind of seeing it through and the daily practice of choosing to be with a question or a person or that uncertainty. So to me, this was a freeing way to look at my relationship to uncertainty, not as like this thing that has to be positive, like I always have to embrace it, but something that could be evolving, and that could be both rewarding and the most difficult task that I would undertake. But to go back to this question of the lived experience of uncertainty, the definition that I really like, because we can define uncertainty in all sorts of ways, right? But the definition I came across that I enjoyed the most appreciated the most was came from a couple of psychologists who were writing a paper about how decision makers conceptualize uncertainty. And the way that they defined it was a sense of doubt that stops or delays action. And I liked that because I think what is so hard about uncertainty for so many of us is the way that it makes us feel stuck, right? And so you feel uncertain, you feel like you can't move forward unless you have answers. And that feeling of stuckness can feel just, like death, right? It just feels so aversive. And so to me, that really got at not just this philosophical idea of uncertainty, but what does it feel like to be uncertain? It feels like you're stuck.
I love that distinction. There's a stuckness with uncertainty, and yet loving doesn't mean it's toxic positivity, but that you have agency in your decision to keep being patient with the questions. So you talk about how these are real questions, not kind of just philosophical. Part of your book draws on philosophy, science, history, art, poetry, the list goes on. It's actually an amazing read in that sense, the synthesis and the deep research you put in. But what I love about this book, and I think many of us can enjoy, is that you do actually bring in real stories. Not just yourself and Anthony, the questions about your career, but some really interesting and varied individuals, scientists, immigrants, caregivers, who are tackling uncertainty in their own lives and have actually reimagined their relationship with uncertainty. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of these stories, or if there was any one particular story that maybe cracked your heart open as you were writing it?
Yeah, gosh, there are so many. And I will say this was my favorite part of the book, was the people that I got to talk with and who were generous enough to let me tell their stories in the book. And one story that really sticks out, and I think particularly in this moment that we're all in, is the story of Barbara Schoen. And this was in a chapter. It was very important to me to try to understand what we could learn from people who were experiencing extreme levels of uncertainty in their lives, because I didn't want this to just be a book about, or for people who have all the privileges in the world, right? And so I wanted to understand, what does this look like for people that hold identities that give them different levels of uncertainty. So I talked to a young man who's an undocumented immigrant. I talked to some folks who are living with disabilities. But again, wanting to understand, what does it look like when you're experiencing this kind of different level of uncertainty day to day than folks, other folks may experience. And the story of Barbara Schoen is she was a woman who grew up working class. She graduated from high school, wasn't really sure what she was going to do with her life, ended up getting a job at an engineering company, and where they gave her the opportunity to go to college, and they paid for her to go to college. From there, she really just kind of climbed up and up and up in her career. She ended up working for a Fortune 500 company, and was felt like she was on this path to success. But at the same time, she was very conscious always of the luck that had gotten her to that point. And she always knew that she wanted to try to give back to the community more, and in her words, that she wanted to try to change the world. But she didn't know how she was going to do that. And she always felt like, well, am I really doing that in my career? Am I on the path to do that? But it was always this kind of, I'll get to it at some point. When Barbara was in her early 30s, she was coming back from her grandmother's funeral with all of her siblings. They were driving. It was a very snowy day. They were coming back. They were in Michigan. And she got into a car accident, and ended up being paralyzed from the waist down. And at that point, there were a few different ways that she could have chosen to live her life. But Barbara describes, and it took her time to get to this point, of course, but she describes the fact that uncertainty that she was experiencing at that point of trying to figure out, who am I now, that I've lost so many parts of my identity before. How do I live? How do I continue? Was for her this moment of liberation, because she had been stuck in this identity and on this path that, if she was being honest, wasn't really the path she wanted to be on. It was a path that she thought was the right one. But she described this experience of losing these parts of her identity as a way for her to grow into a different one, and one that for her has been much more fulfilling. She is giving back in the way that she had imagined. It's a different way now, but she's devoted a lot of her life now to finding and giving resources to people living with disabilities like herself, and helping people who have had that experience but haven't been as lucky as her find the resources that they need to live empowered lives. So I think about that, and I'm reminded of her story a lot when I feel stuck, or when I feel like the uncertainty in my life or in the world is feeling, incredibly overwhelming. That there is this opportunity and freedom there if we can find it.
There are really inspiring stories in the book, and I particularly enjoyed it. It is humbling to read the levels of uncertainty that some others are living with. Mm-hmm. It puts into perspective the uncertainty that certainly I sometimes feel. I feel like one of the things that's really cool is you're a journalist. That's one of the hats you wear. And there was a bit of journalism with this part of the book, wasn't there? Going on these trips, interviewing folks. Was there anything unexpected actually about the process of telling people stories, even though that is something you're used to professionally?
Yeah, I think I don't know that it was, I should have expected it, but it was still somewhat of a, the number of times that you have to interview people to get the full story, even if you're just talking about, one small event in their life. I was struck by how many times I would talk to somebody for a few hours and think, all right, I've got it now. And then I would be writing it out, and I would realize, oh, there are a few details. Oh, there are a few more questions. And so you just have to kind of go back again and again. And that's why I'm so grateful to the people who I spent time with, because not only would I often spend time with people in person and meet, family members, but there were so many calls and Zooms, and people were just so generous with their time. But it really, I think, it was such a cool experience, because you realize, and I think we all do this, there's a superficial story that we tell maybe the first time we talk to someone, and then there are so many layers deeper than that. And often we're not even aware that we're telling a superficial story, but through multiple conversations, you can kind of dig in a little bit more. And so that was a really maybe a little slightly unexpected, but certainly enjoyable part of the
I
experience.
mean, you had to ask more questions.
Right, exactly,
That was
exactly.
such a surprise.
Yeah.
But I think what's cool is like not every question is equal. And this is a good segue actually into the part of the book. And as a fellow, I know you love hiking, as someone who loves trees. One of the most powerful metaphors in the book is actually this idea that questions are different parts of a tree. Tell us a little bit about this metaphor. Kind of what are some of the different types of questions, and what are some of the questions we shouldn't maybe be focused on as much?
Yeah. So, as I was writing this book, a question that came up and again and again was, what type of questions are you talking about? Because there are questions, everything from what are we having for dinner tonight, which is a very important question, to, you're right, like, what am I doing with my life? Who am I? And so I will say first that the book is really focused on this question, the questions that fundamentally do not have fast, easy answers. And so the questions that are really surrounding questions of identity, of meaning, of love, loss, relationships, right? So that's what the book is really rooted in. But as far as the framework, this kind of framework that you're referring to, I break up the types of questions in life in general into different parts of a fruit tree. So you can think about the first category of questions like peaches. So peaches ripen quickly, and in the same way, these are questions that are kind of short-term answerable questions. So a question like, will I get the job, right? You're going to find out the answer to that question, and you're going to find out pretty quickly. The next category of question is a pawpaw question. And maybe you've heard of pawpaws, maybe you haven't, but in the course of writing this book, I learned that the pawpaw tree, it takes the fruit 5 to 7 years it takes the tree 5 to 7 years for the fruit to grow and ripen. So these are the type of questions that have a slightly longer time horizon. So maybe you're wondering, will this career shift that I've made be one that is meaningful, that I enjoy? And then there are the heartwood questions. Heartwood is the part of the tree that stays with it throughout the tree's life, and that's the part of the tree that gives it its stability and strength. And heartwood questions are the ones fundamentally that the book is concerned with. These are the ones that really stay with you through your life. They're the questions about, who are you? Who are you becoming? What is it that's going to give you a life of meaning and purpose? And so those are the questions that aren't really answerable in any kind of permanent way. Those are the questions that you kind of keep exploring. And then the final category of questions is the dead leaves. And these are the questions that, like dead leaves, you'd probably be better off releasing. They're the questions that maybe keep you stuck in the past. And they're the questions that fuel patterns of rumination and regret. And so, those are really kind of the core categories that I'm talking about.
So as I'm hearing you describe peaches, which makes me hungry also, it strikes me that because you talk a lot about how we have this addiction, this cultural addiction or obsession with fast, easy answers, but not all questions can be quickly answered. They're not all peaches. Mm-hmm. As someone who actually is in this profession, coaching, a lot of people come to you for answers. Yeah. And sometimes, I have to hold myself back. I can't answer. This is maybe your heartwood question. This is your question to answer. There's this, I think, obsession with fast answers. We don't want to sit with these questions, the ones that take longer to ripen or can never really be answered. So we see people kind of turning to, generative AI, a lot of us probably getting out our phones, Google searches, but also we outsource certainty to these gurus. Yeah. Whether it's astrologists that you refer to in the book, coaches, therapists, I see a lot of nods. I know a lot of us are like, please answer my question for me. And you refer to this eloquently as the charlatans of certainty. So tell us a little bit more about these charlatans. Who are they? Why are we so seduced by these folks who claim to have answers to questions that maybe shouldn't be ripe yet?
Yeah. And let me just say, I have been there and wanting answers and being seduced myself. And I talk about that extensively in the book. So I'm not like, floating on some cloud, like I'm immune from any of this. It's my own journey too. And to back up for a second, a big part of the reason that we're seduced by fast, easy answers and who I call the charlatans of certainty, is because we're biologically wired to want certainty. So at a brain level, navigating uncertainty takes more energy than certainty. If you just think about a day where everything is kind of happening as you planned it, right? Like you have your breakfast, you go into work, nothing is out of sorts. That's a day that requires much less energy from you metabolically than a day where everything goes wrong, right? And you're just kind of running around and you spill coffee all over yourself and you're late because something, so it's just a totally different experience for your body. And so our bodies far prefer the experience where nothing goes wrong and everything happens according to plan, because it means we're expending less energy. So on that level, we're seduced from, this very basic biological need to want certainty. And in comes this force of, that's fueled in a lot of ways by our social media culture, of charlatans of certainty and the way that I would define charlatans of certainty is these are the people that are kind of knowingly exploiting and manipulating this desire that we all have for certainty and answers. And you can think about what they're providing to us with the analogy, I think, of like junk food or highly processed food. So a lot of times what they're doing is they're taking information that we all might want or need, and they're stripping it of its nutritional value, and they're kind of putting it into like a bite-sized piece that might feel good or satiating in the moment, but that actually isn't giving us the nourishment that we might want or need. And the other way I think to think about, who is a charlatan of certainty, charlatans of certainty, and this is something that comes in the book from a woman that I interviewed who wrote about the self-help industry. Her name is Jessica Lamb Shapiro. She writes about open and closed systems. And charlatans are people that create closed systems. And what that means is that they might be trying to sell you an answer or a solution, but in a closed system, if the answer or the solution doesn't work, well, that's because something's wrong with you. That's not because the answer or the solution is the wrong thing. So you need to just keep buying what I'm selling and fix yourself, versus, going somewhere else or trying something else that will work for you. In an open system, it's the opposite. So maybe you're a therapist or a coach or, an expert of some kind, and you're sharing some insight, but the fundamental idea is, hey, maybe this works for you, maybe it doesn't. If it works, that's great. I'm happy to help. If it doesn't, like try something else. But that's kind of the way that I've come to think about what distinguishes a charlatan from a non-charlatan.
That's a really practical distinction because I think it's a nuance that is important. You're not saying anyone in those professions is a charlatan. It's those that are closed, purporting closed systems. And it's interesting you bring up that language. Actually, in Australia last month, we had an article written in The Guardian, and then there was an ABC interview where they wanted me to admit that all coaching profession are charlatans, essentially. Like, oh, so coaches, they're all pyramid schemes, right? And I actually didn't have the language at the time, but this is a beautiful way that you've made that distinction when someone is blamed as being the problem rather than the fact that maybe this tool isn't the right one for you.
Exactly.
And that's a kind of a really nice segue into the practicality of your book. So one of the things I love about this book, and for those of you who haven't seen it, there's a beautiful 2-page layout of questions map. And as someone who loves geography and travel, there's a little bit of a map that takes you through how to be with questions. Can you talk to us a little bit more about this map and how we might use it for those of us sitting here with questions to be answered, and of what's the first place we can start?
Yeah. So this came out of a neuroscience finding that was really interesting to me, which was we use the same part of our brains to navigate uncertainty in mental space as we do in physical space. And this makes sense when you think about the way that we describe the experience of uncertainty, right? A lot of times we'll talk about we're kind of in a fog, or we've hit a dead end, or we're kind of walking in circles, or we use a lot of physical space and geographical space metaphors to talk about the experience of living uncertainty in our lives. And so I was struck by this, and wanted very much to create practical tools for people who are dealing with uncertainty in their lives to be able to navigate that more easily. And so created the map to help people in like kind of a guided, reflective way to work through uncertainty and questions, not necessarily as a way to get to answers, but to get to clarity. Because you'll see if you go through the map, you may reach the end of the map, and actually the person who designed the map is right here, Katrina. It's really a way to understand fundamentally, are the questions that I'm asking the questions I want to ask? Or are there different questions that I actually want to be guiding my life? And so I would say the place to start and the beginning of the map is really getting an understanding of what is my question right now, or what is, and a lot of times that starts with a feeling that you're having. So maybe you're not even aware of a question that is guiding your life at the moment, but maybe you are aware that you're feeling stressed or anxious or upset. And this is a feeling that a lot of us have when we're uncertain, right? Or we don't know what to do next, or we're trying to figure out what to do next. And so the first part of the map is really about understanding, okay, what is the question that's maybe behind this feeling? And is this the type of question that I want to be asking? And we'll maybe get to this in a second, but there are all sorts of ways too to try to understand what makes a great question, and are there other questions that you could be asking in that moment?
Well, that's actually exactly where I wanted to go. As someone who gets paid to ask questions, tell us what more makes a good question? Kind of what's the architecture or structure of a great question, and what should we be thinking about as we're crafting them, either in those of us who ask questions professionally or for our own lives, the questions that we have?
Yeah. So one of the biggest insights for me and what makes a great question, and something I realized from my own experience too, was really trying to ask questions that aren't binaries, right? And so I think it can be very easy to fall into that, like, well, should I do this, or will this happen or not? And those are fine questions to ask, but in terms of what I think makes a great question is it opening up a field of possibilities for you in your life, or is it narrowing or closing them off? And I think binaries, by their nature, binary questions, are putting you down like a yes, no, or maybe path, right? And usually just yes or no. And so what I look for in a great question is this question of, is it opening you up, or is it narrowing the possibilities for your life? And this was something that one of the Zen Buddhist leaders who I talked to, Joan Sutherland, she described a great question as one that opens up the doors and windows of a room or blows down the walls of the room entirely. And I really loved that idea and that metaphor for what makes a great question. And the other thing that I would say that makes for a great question is it guiding you back to who you are and what you want? Something that I found from interviewing, again, like scientists, activists, poets, artists, just so many people that I talked to for this book, and who told me about their own questions, practices. These were people who were using questions as kind of an internal GPS, and they were using questions as tools to find their way back to who they were and what they wanted, and to kind of try to find a sense of integrity within themselves. So that's the other thing I think we can all get caught up in, trying to design and drive our lives towards the expectations of other people, right? And so, and that's where those should questions come in. And I think the more we can use questions to get back to who we are and what we want, the better they're going to serve us.
I love this analogy of an internal GPS. It's actually really beautiful language, because some of the best therapists and coaches I've worked with call themselves an external GPS, in that they help you navigate your own way, but you can get there without them. Yeah. But it's a nice kind of mirroring of the internal GPS we refer to. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I'd love to spend a bit of time talking about the process of actually writing the book before we open it up for Q&A. This is your first book, And it's so exciting because I remember we were on the phone in July and you're about to give birth, but you're also about to give birth to twins, but not in the biological sense. And so talk to us a little bit about the process of writing your first book. What was the most gratifying parts of this process? And I'm sure there's the messiness that comes with gratification, but yeah, I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. This was the most amazing professional thing that I ever had the opportunity to do. It was such a gratifying experience. I think the my favorite part by far was the people that I was able to meet in the process of writing, and hearing their stories and feeling so fortunate to get to know them. It's so special. But I think the process of writing it, and I think folks who are creative will probably appreciate this. It's a lot of ups and downs. So there were a lot of really high moments of feeling so excited. I'd just done a great interview and it was so fun. And then there were a lot of moments where I was completely stuck in the mud and was like, what is this about? What am I even doing here? And was always conscious of the fact that I was writing a book about uncertainty and often very uncertain about what I was doing and how I was articulating some of these ideas. And you brought up the pregnancy. Yes, that was I was about halfway through writing and reporting the book when I got pregnant with my son, who's I think he's still back here, and it was that was. I write about this a little bit in the book too, but I was very sick for most of the pregnancy. But the good thing about that was I spent a lot of time on the couch, and this book was a great distraction. So I was like, well, I still have to write and do this, and might as well do it from my couch. So it was one of the, I think the process of it too. I used to feel like I had to be in the perfect mindset and have the perfect location in order to write. I remember thinking like, oh, I have to be at my favorite coffee shop and have this nice drink and have gotten a great night of sleep and all that. And that all really goes out the window when you are throwing up every hour or so, and also when you have a deadline staring you down. So it was a humbling process of really having to of having to write every day, whether I felt like it or not. But I will say too, one of the best parts of the whole process too was getting to work with my husband, who not only is a character in the book, but is is a novelist himself, and he has been from the beginning one of the biggest supporters of me in this book and my work. But in the writing of the book, he was, reading early drafts of it, helped me so much in thinking about how to tell the story differently, because he's an expert on narrative. And so he was able to kind of bring his own expertise and ideas, not just as this partner that I have, but as somebody who is expert in his own craft. And so it was such a meaningful experience on so many levels, but that was a big part of it too.
It's the bookends of the book, isn't it? It starts with Anthony, and then he's in your acknowledgements around the person that's editing the very parts written about himself.
Right. Well, of course, because I would never have wanted to just publish a book and like, hey, honey, surprise, you're in this book. But yes, he was very much a part of this from the beginning.
And actually, Anthony doesn't know this, but in our first coffee catch-up that I alluded to 8 years ago, I vividly remember the thing that you mentioned about Anthony, you introduced him back then, was that he asks really good questions.
Yes.
And it seems
I finally found someone who would ask me a question.
It's a passion that brings you together.
Yeah.
Now, we're really excited to have this book birthed and out in the world. And for those of us who are here and joining online as people who want to support you, what can we do best to help get this magic out in the world so that everyone can benefit from the wisdom in it?
Well, thank you for that question. And I want to say I'm so grateful to all of you who are here and joining online. It's so meaningful to me. And I think for me, to take a step back, what's so important to me right now is, and why I wrote the book, frankly, is I want it to be a companion for people who are dealing with really hard uncertainty in their lives. I wanted that when I was going through it, and that is why I wrote the book. And so my greatest hope is that it finds people who need it. Books have been sources of kind of calm and insight and companionship for me at various points in my life, and I'm sure they have for all of you. But the best way to do that is visibility, right? And trying to share it with as many people as we can. And so my biggest ask at this point is, if you do end up buying the book, if you have a copy of the book, to take a picture of yourself and share it on social media, which sounds really simple, but I've seen, even just from folks who have done that already, it has a huge impact. That like network effect, even if like 3 people see it, if one of those people is struggling right now and a book helps them, that's exactly what I'm hoping for. And so that would be the most meaningful thing. And of course, if you tag me, I will share it too. But that's the biggest ask right now.
I think that's really important, because this is a book that can help. I'm definitely going to be sharing it with everyone I work with. As someone in the world of leadership and coaching, I don't have all the answers, but we can help people ask better questions. Fun fact, after resharing some of the folks who had shared the book photos, I had a judge in Australia from 15 years ago that I hadn't seen reach out and say, I need to read this book. I need to be able to not have all the answers. And so what's really cool about that is, as a former lawyer, you get paid to have all the answers, or as a judge, but actually those of us who most think we need answers want that invitation to be able to ask questions.
Totally.
So thank you for this amazing book you've written. It would be remiss for me not to ask, is there another baby on the way? And when I say that, I mean of the literary form. What do you think? And it's early days, let's celebrate, but could we expect part 2 as a writer and someone I know really enjoys the process?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I have an idea for what I want the next book to be. I'm trying as much as I can to
sit with the question.
Yeah, sit with the question, exactly. And try to enjoy the process of getting this book out into the world. But I am also very excited about a next book, and I have started to think about and plan for that a little bit. But
well, I won't force you to tell us what it's going to be about, to keep that a bit of a secret. But before we open it up, one final question, which is, you spent years writing this fabulous book. What question are you still sitting with after writing the book?
So I think the question that I'm sitting with, and that I sit with kind of every day, and particularly in the kind of aftermath of the book, is, and this is something that I get into a little bit in the book too, which is how do I detach my value as a person from accomplishments? And I think it's a really hard thing to do for many of us. But I think I'm continuously thinking about, how do I not value myself based on external validation, or, the external kind of accomplishments or credentials or whatever it is that may exist or not. And so I'm thinking about that. That's a question that I'm continuously living. And how do you kind of detach from outcomes, right? And then I think this question of how do I reconcile who I was before having a child with who I am now? And I think that's a question that I'm constantly kind of trying to live into and understand. How is my identity changing? How to kind of marry the professional with the personal, and what does that look like? So those are 2 of the questions.
They're huge and powerful questions, but I feel like universal questions, probably ones that a lot of us grapple with. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your words, your wisdom. Please keep writing, and please, everyone, check out this incredible book if you haven't. And it is one that you don't want to miss, and is just so full of storytelling and wisdom and practicality, which we often don't get all in one book. Now, we have some time for some questions from the audience. We are live streaming, so we will have a microphone. But maybe let's put our hands together first for Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And any questions from our lovely
We have to have
audience?
questions because of the title of the book, How to Fall in Love with Questions. So
We won't judge the questions.
no judging here. I want to just say before we go into questions that I loved your analogy of the fruit and the tree and the dead leaves. And as you said that, I'm picturing in my mind some of the questions I've asked myself as dead leaves just kind of falling off. And it was just such a beautiful analogy. So I want to thank you for that.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
you're welcome. Oh, here's one back here.
Hi. What question or maybe kind of question do you wish people would ask you more?
So I wish people would ask me more. Interesting. I think it's it's a category of question, and I think and I would love to get better at this too. It's the follow-up question, because I think a lot of times we maybe ask a question, somebody gives us a response. The follow-up question is really such a great signal of listening, and I think that's where we can get a little hazy as a culture, and so I think I always appreciate the follow-up question because that really shows, oh, you didn't just ask me this initial question, you listened to my answer and you're curious and you want to know a little more, or you're kind of still turned on in that way. So, but good question.
I would offer a follow-up.
Yeah, thanks.
You mentioned about listening, and that made me start thinking about how so many times it's so important to, when you ask questions, to listen, or when someone asks you questions, to listen rather than answer right away. Can you just talk a little bit about that, the idea of listening?
Yeah. Well, I think I think the idea of listening is so key. And it's, I would think about listening interpersonally, but also listening to yourself. And a big part of the book and a big insight that I had in writing the book was that our relationship to uncertainty is really a proxy for our relationship to ourselves. And so I think so often when we're on paths where we're getting seduced by fast, easy answers, or we're feeling kind of detached from who we are or what we want, we're not listening to ourselves, and maybe we're asking questions but we're not listening to the true answers. And so I think listening is this kind of layered concept in that way. It's about listening to other people, but you kind of have to start with listening to yourself. and once you have that type of relationship, you are able to listen to others. And I will also say too, one of the big insights from following around communities of people the communities that kind of exist around enabling people to live in uncertainty, and that's a whole part of the book as well, is that these are communities of people who were not oriented around giving other people answers, which I think is such an instinct that we have. Somebody comes to you and they have a problem, they have a question. We want to just say, oh, have you tried this? Or like, why don't you read this book? Which is fine, right? That's what we all do. But the communities that really worked in helping people live with and through uncertainty were the ones where they weren't trying to give answers. They were asking people open and honest questions, and they were really trying to just be with someone and listen to them and accompany them along their journey of uncertainty rather than trying to solve it, right? And so I think that's another place where like listening comes up, is it's not about necessarily going in and saying, oh, I know what you should do, or I can help you in this way, but just being there, which is profound, right? It's actually not passive. It's this very hard and active thing to do, because it means you're in it with them, and you can't just kind of fly away with like, oh, well, I gave them that tip and they're probably fine. So.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hey, Joey.
Thank you for writing this book. When I listened to you talk, my book arrived this morning, so I haven't read it yet. Maybe you get to it in the book, but one thing that comes to mind for me is that one of the oldest, most popular ways of dealing with uncertainty is religion. Or today, I would say mindfulness and meditation or Buddhism, right, can be very popular, at least in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm just curious about sort of your thoughts on religious approaches or, maybe mindfulness and meditation or however you want to take that. But I'm just kind of curious how you see those things intersecting.
Oh yeah, very much. I think they very much intersect. And I will say, as part of this book, I really wanted to make sure to engage all sorts of disciplines that had taken up this question of how to live better in uncertainty. So it meant interviewing religious scholars. It meant, folks who had focused on mindfulness and spirituality, because those are big parts of our culture and our lives that have dealt with those challenges. And so, in the book, the religion that I focus on most is Buddhism and Buddhist practices, but I also do touch on Christianity and Judaism and the ways and Hinduism to a certain extent, and how questioning is built into some of those religions and religious cultures. But that to me, it was very important for me to kind of draw from all of those wisdom traditions, because I think, again, for certain people, certain tools and certain answers and ideas are going to be more helpful and supportive than others. And I think we live in a culture where, it can be easy to say, oh, I only believe in this wisdom tradition, or I don't want to believe in this one. But I think that there are elements of all of these, all of these disciplines, whether it's religion or mindfulness, spirituality, science, philosophy, art, that to me really came together into a tapestry of a deeper knowing of how to live and thrive in uncertainty.
I think we're going to need to close out here.
There are always more questions.
There's
but
always
that's the
questions,
point.
and we're going to do a quick reset here, put a table up so that you can have your book signed and ask more questions. Something popped in my head, the idea of question authority, and I always loved that saying, and I think right now might be a really good time to start using those bumper stickers again. But everybody, go out, purchase the book, give it to friends who are struggling. I think it's a wonderful, relevant book to suggest to people who are going through all kinds of stuff. Or not, but they will be soon. So we all are. All right. Thank you so much for being here. And the book is available at the counter. You can purchase it and come back here to have it signed. Have a lovely rest of your weekend. Thank you.